In October of 1886, the Montana wind did not merely blow, it screamed across the Gallatin Valley. Adelaide Vance pulled a wooden handcart through the frozen ruts. Her 5-year-old son sat inside it. Her 8-year-old daughter struggled beside her. She had spent her last 3 cents in Bozeman. Ahead of them stood the mountains. Behind them was every place that had turned them away. And somewhere beyond the next rise, a lonely old rancher was about to offer them the one thing they no longer believed they could find: a home. Leo was wrapped in a thin wool shawl. Beside the cart, Hattie fought the wind with every small step. Her boots were worn through at the soles. Adelaide kept walking because stopping would mean explaining to her children that she had nowhere left to take them. Adelaide looked at the horizon and felt a cold stone of terror in her stomach. In 1886, a widow with 2 children could still own property and make her own choices. But choices meant little when she had no money, no family nearby, and 2 hungry children depending on her. The frontier offered little mercy to a woman who had run out of second chances. They passed a gate made of weathered gray cedar. A sign swung violently on rusted, screaming hinges. The wood screeched in the wind like a soul in torment. It read, "Broken Spur Ranch." The house beyond the gate was sturdy and defiant. It was built of heavy, hand-hewn logs and riverstone. It looked like a fortress built against the very elements themselves. However, the yard was a graveyard of bitter neglect. Rusty tools lay half-buried in the freezing black mud. A broken plow sat like the skeletal remains of a forgotten era. The barn doors were banging rhythmically against the heavy frame. Bang, bang, bang. No dogs barked to greet the weary travelers. No horses whinnied from the dark, cold stalls. The silence between the gusts of wind was deafening and heavy. Suddenly, a heavy, gravelly voice broke through the freezing air. "You there, woman!" Adelaide stopped dead in her tracks. She pulled the cart handle close to her chest like a rusted weapon.
An old man stepped out onto the porch of the log house. He was tall and imposing, a shadow against the dim light, but his frame was bent like a storm-swept pine tree. His beard was a wild, unkempt thicket of tarnished silver. He wore a heavy canvas duster, stained with years of grease and oil. In his right hand he gripped a gnarled walking stick. His knuckles were as knobby and hard as the wood itself. "Where are you headed in this hail?" the man asked. His voice was deep, echoing like stones grinding in a riverbed. His eyes were sharp, piercing, and terrifyingly clear. They were as blue as the center of a hot blue flame. "South," Adelaide replied, her voice raspy from the dust and the cold. The man spat on the frozen ground with a grimace. "There's nothing south but the mountains and the crows. There is nothing but the winter, and it's coming for us all," he said. He looked at Hattie's shivering, narrow shoulders. He saw the girl's teeth chattering like dry bones. He looked at Leo's pale, sunken face peering from the cart. "The sky is falling," the man muttered to himself. "I can smell the ice coming on the north wind."
It's a heavy smell, the smell of a burying snow. Adelaide didn't answer him because she had no words left to give. She reached down to pull the cart handle once again. Her muscles screamed in a silent, agonizing protest. "Wait," the man called out, his voice cracking. He stepped down the porch stairs with a heavy, painful limp. Each step seemed to require a monumental, soul-crushing effort. "My name is Silas Thorne," the old man said. "My wife, Martha, has been gone 3 winters now." He looked back at the dark house, as if he could still see her standing in one of its windows. "I am 70 years old. I am tired of burnt beans, empty rooms, and talking to no one but the wind." Then his eyes moved to Leo and Hattie. "Your children need a roof before the snow comes." He looked at Adelaide again. "And I need someone who can make this place feel alive." Adelaide swallowed hard. "I can cook," she said,
but I can also mend, clean, keep a fire, and do whatever work needs doing." Silas gave one slow nod.
"Then come inside. Room and board until spring. No wages, but you and those children will be safe here." Adelaide did not hesitate for a second. She pulled the cart onto the porch, the wood groaning under the weight. As they crossed the threshold, the warmth hit them like a physical blow. It was a weight against their skin, but it was a stale and neglected warmth. The air smelled of old, stale tobacco and unwashed wool. It smelled of rancid lard and the lonely scent of a man living alone. It was the smell of a house that had forgotten the touch of a woman. For one brief moment, Adelaide stood perfectly still. The warmth made her knees weaken. She was afraid that if she let herself feel safe, even for a second, she might begin to cry and never stop. So she pressed her lips together, took off her gloves, and asked Silas where he kept the flour. Silas pointed to a small, dark room tucked off the kitchen. "That's yours for now. There's a straw mattress and a heavy, moth-eaten root." He walked over to the heavy cast-iron stove in the center of the room. "The fire is burning low, nearly dead. See if you can find something in the pantry ruins. See if you can make a meal out of what's left behind." Adelaide walked into the kitchen and saw a disaster of neglect. Stacks of tin plates sat unwashed on a scarred wooden table. The floor was covered in layers of dried mud and forgotten crumbs. In the pantry, she found a meager, insulting supply. There was a half-empty sack of flour and a jar of dark molasses. There was a slab of salt pork covered in a fine layer of dust. She moved with a silent, focused, and frantic energy. She did not waste a single motion of her tired limbs. She stoked the fire with dry, seasoned pine until it roared. She waited until the stove glowed a dull, comforting cherry red. She washed the plates with boiling water and a prayer. She sliced the salt pork thin, almost transparent. She fried it until the fat warmed the pan with a gentle hiss. She mixed flour, water, and a bit of the precious grease. She made a simple, hearty bread that smelled of life itself. Hattie and Leo sat at the table, watching the steam rise from the pan. They watched the steam rise from the pan like it was a miracle. Silas sat in his heavy rocking chair by the dying hearth. He watched her every move with the intensity of a hunting hawk. He saw how she didn't waste a single precious grain of flour. He saw how she moved with grace despite the weight of her exhaustion. He saw how she tucked the children into the small straw bed. She used a tenderness he had forgotten existed in this hard world. When the meal was finally served, the room was heavy with silence. Only the sound of chewing and the crackle of fire filled the air. Silas finished his plate and wiped his silver beard with a sleeve. "Better than the burnt black beans I've been eating," he grunted. "Tomorrow we prepare for the end of the world. The great die-up is coming. I feel it in my very bones." Adelaide didn't know what he meant by that terrifying phrase. She didn't know the bloody history of the High Plains yet. She didn't know that 1886 would be remembered as a cursed year. The cattle industry was booming with a dangerous, blind greed. The land was overgrazed, exhausted, and stripped bare. The grass was chewed down to the very roots by a million mouths. The cattle were weak, thin, and unprepared for what was coming. And the sky was preparing a hammer of pure, unadulterated ice. The next morning, Adelaide woke at 4 in the freezing dark. The house was bone-chillingly cold, a tomb of wood and stone. Frost had formed intricate crystalline patterns on the inside of the glass. She didn't complain, and she didn't make a single sound of protest. She built the fire until the kitchen was a sanctuary of heat. She found an old broom made of dried willow twigs. She swept the entire house, every corner and every shadow. She cleared away the thick cobwebs of 3 years of lonely grief. She found a wicker basket hidden in a dusty corner. It held Martha's old, forgotten sewing supplies. There were rusted needles and spools of faded silk thread. There were beautiful, heartbreaking scraps of colorful calico. Adelaide felt a sharp, agonizing pang of nostalgia for a life lost. She remembered her own mother's hands in far-off Ohio. She remembered the rhythm of the needle and the song of the kettle. She took Silas's heavy work coat from the rusted hook.
The elbows were blown out completely, exposing the lining. Most of the buttons were missing or hanging by a single thread. She sat by the window as the sun began its pale rise. She mended the coat with small, careful stitches. Then she used strong linen thread to reinforce the worn seams.
When Silas limped into the kitchen, he stopped dead. He saw his mended coat lying on the scrubbed table. It looked nearly new, a testament to her skill and care. He reached out and touched the mended elbow with a calloused hand. His fingers trembled ever so slightly, a flicker of emotion. He turned away before Adelaide could see that his eyes had filled. "Martha used to mend that coat every Sunday," he said quietly. Then, after a long pause, he added, "She always said a thing worth keeping deserved another chance." Instead, he reached deep into his pocket. He handed her a heavy, cold iron key. Then he placed a small leather purse on the table. "There is enough cash for the first supplies," he said. "And Mercer's store still honors my account. Tell him I sent you." Adelaide looked at the purse but did not touch it. "You trust me with this?" "No," Silas said. "Not yet." Then the corner of his mouth moved. "But I trust the way you looked at those children when they were hungry."
The root cellar is nearly empty, a hollow cave. Take the wagon into town today, before the sky breaks. The horses are in the barn, waiting and restless. Buy what we need to last 4 months of winter, maybe 5 if the gods are feeling cruel. Don't be frugal with the fat, the salt, or the coffee. Adelaide drove the wagon into the town of Bozeman. The town was buzzing with a frantic, nervous, and electric energy. In Bozeman, some ranchers still laughed at warnings of a hard winter, but the older settlers were buying coal, blankets, salt, and feed. They had seen enough Montana winters to know that the land could turn cruel without warning. Adelaide bought sacks of dried apples and buckets of beans. She bought salted beef and 3 heavy barrels of flour. She bought a heavy bolt of thick, warm wool flannel. At the last moment, Adelaide spent 2 pennies of her own money on a small bag of peppermint sticks. That night, she gave 1 to each child. Leo held his in both hands as if it were treasure. As she was loading the heavy sacks, a woman passed by. She wore a fine silk dress and a stole of expensive fur. She stopped and looked at Adelaide's muddy, tattered skirts.
She looked at the grime on Adelaide's face with a sneer. "Living out at the Thorn place, are you?" the woman asked. Her voice was dripping with a cold, sharp, and jagged judgment. "I am the cook, and I am proud to be," Adelaide replied. She kept her head high, her eyes burning with dignity. "People are talking in the shops," the woman sneered. "A widow alone with an old man in the middle of nowhere. It's indecent, unseemly, and a stain on this town." Adelaide felt her face flush with a sudden righteous anger. "What's indecent is letting innocent children starve," she said. "What's indecent is turning your back on the coming cold." She climbed onto the high wagon seat with a straight back. She snapped the reins with a sharp authority. She didn't care about the toxic gossip of a small town. She only cared about the heat in the iron stove. She cared about the solid roof over Hattie and Leo's heads. When she returned to the ranch, Silas was struggling in the barn. He was trying to move a heavy, frozen bale of hay. His bad hip buckled beneath him, and he slumped against the barn wall. Adelaide ran to him through the freezing black mud. "Let me help you, Silas," she said, reaching out. "I can handle my own damn work," he snapped through gritted teeth. His face was pale with a blinding, white-hot pain. "No, you can't," she said firmly, her voice like iron. "Not today, and not like this." She put his heavy, shaking arm over her shoulder. She was surprisingly strong for her small, slight size. She helped him back to the house, step by agonizing step. She made him sit in the heavy wooden rocking chair. She took a pot of hot, steaming water from the stove. She added dried herbs she had found in a dusty jar. "Sit still," Adelaide said. "You are done working for today." Silas looked like he wanted to argue, to roar at her. He looked like he wanted to reclaim his fading pride. Then he looked into her eyes and saw a reflection of himself. He saw the same iron will he had once possessed in his youth. He saw a person who would not be moved by wind or man. He sat back and let her care for him for the first time. That night, Adelaide sat by the fire as the children slept. She had the colorful scraps of Martha's old calico. She began to sew a quilt, her fingers moving with precision. She used the log cabin pattern, an old and storied design.
It was a pattern of survival, structure, and endurance. A small red square in the center represented the warm hearth. The light and dark strips represented the walls of the home. They represented the shadows and the light of the world outside. As she sewed, she felt a profound, deep sense of peace. She was building a home with every single stitch. She was doing it one thread at a time, mending the world. Hattie sat beside her on a small wooden stool. The girl was learning how to thread a needle in the firelight. "Mommy, will we stay here forever?" Hattie asked softly. Adelaide paused mid-stitch, the needle hovering in the air. The needle pricked her finger, a tiny, sharp pain. A tiny drop of bright red blood appeared on the white fabric. "We stay until the spring, my love," she said. But in her heart, she felt the roots of the ranch taking hold. She was starting to love the lonely sound of the wind. She was starting to love the scent of the burning pine logs.
She saw how Silas looked at the children when he thought she wasn't looking. He watched them with a hunger for a family he had lost. He had found an old carved wooden horse in the dark attic. He had spent the afternoon sanding it until it was smooth. He was making it perfect for Leo's small, curious hands. He was a hard man, shaped by a hard and unforgiving land. But he was not a hollow man, and he was not a cruel one. He was just a man who had been frozen solid by his own grief. Before winter closes in, we would love to hear from you. What made your childhood home feel safe? A warm meal, a familiar quilt, or someone waiting by the fire? If stories of courage and family still speak to your heart, please subscribe and share your memory in the comments. By mid-November, the temperature was hovering near 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The ground froze as solid and as cold as black granite. The cattle on the open range were coolies. They stood in tight, shivering, and doomed circles. Silas grew more anxious with every passing frozen hour. "The grass is too short for them to survive," he told Adelaide. "The barons have overstocked the land with too many cattle. There are too many hungry mouths and not enough feed. If the snow falls deep, they won't be able to reach the grass. They will starve where they stand, huddling for warmth. They will become frozen white statues in the drifts." Adelaide looked at the Broken Spur's small, modest herd. Silas had only 50 head of cattle left to his name. They were kept in a small fenced pasture near the house. It was close to the safety and the shelter of the barn. Adelaide insisted they prepare the ranch before the weather turned worse. Silas showed her where the salvaged boards and pine boughs were stored. Together, they built a windbreak along the north side of the pasture. Hattie and Leo stayed close to the house, carrying only small bundles of kindling and helping Adelaide sort the dry wood. They stacked the remaining hay inside the barn, covered the roof gaps with old boards, and sealed the cabin's worst cracks with mud and straw. It was not enough to defeat a Montana winter, but it might be enough to give the cattle and the family a chance. One afternoon, a visitor arrived at the Broken Spur. It was Barnaby Thorne, Silas's only living nephew. He was a man who wore polished leather boots and a fake smile. He carried a silver-tipped cane as a useless fashion piece. He looked at the ranch with greed burning in his eyes. He didn't see a home or a legacy. He saw an inheritance. "Uncle," Barnaby said with a voice like curdled cream. "You're much too old and broken for this harsh life. Sign the ranch over to me today for your own good. I'll put you in a nice, warm boarding house in the city. You can live out your days in Great Falls, in comfort." He looked at Adelaide with a cruel, mocking and low sneer. "And I'll find a proper, quiet servant for this house, one without all this extra hungry baggage following her." He gestured toward the children with a flick of his wrist. Silas stood up slowly, his joints popping like dry wood. He leaned heavily on his walking stick, but his back was straight. His eyes were like blue ice, cold and terrifying. "I'm not dead yet, Barnaby, though I know you wish it. And Adelaide isn't a servant in this house. She's the reason this house is still standing tonight. She's the reason it doesn't smell like a cold grave in here." Barnaby's face twisted with a sudden, ugly rage. "You're being fooled by a widow's tears, old man. A pretty face and a few hot meals have blinded your eyes. The town is talking, Silas, saying you've lost your wits.
They say you've let a vagrant take over your mind.
Get out of my sight before I forget your blood, Silas roared. His voice shook the glass windows in their heavy frames. Barnaby rode away in a cloud of dust, but before he reached the gate, he turned in the saddle. You may be too stubborn to sign today, he called to Silas, but winter has a way of making old men change their minds. Then he looked at Adelaide. And when spring comes, I'll ask the court what belongs to family and what belongs to a stranger. He rode away before Adelaide could answer, but the poison of his words remained hanging in the air. Adelaide felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the gossip. She went to her small room, her heart feeling like lead. She began to pack her small, tattered bag. She did not want Barnaby to use her presence as a weapon against Silas. For the first time since arriving, Adelaide wondered if staying at the Broken Spur might cost the children the very safety she had promised them. "What in the hell are you doing?" Silas asked from the doorway. "I won't let you lose your name because of us," Adelaide said. Her eyes were wet with unshed tears of shame. "I've spent my whole life building this ranch," Silas said softly. "The only thing I've truly lost is my own loneliness." "Put that bag away right now, Adelaide Vance. The snow is coming tonight. I can feel it. I can feel the ice settling in my very marrow." He was right, and the world was about to change. That evening, the first great blizzard of the winter of 1886-87 rolled across Montana. It did not start with a few gentle, dancing flakes. It started with a solid, blinding wall of white. The world was erased from existence in mere seconds. The wind roared at 60 miles per hour, a demonic sound. The temperature plummeted to 40 below zero. The hard winter, later remembered as the Great Die-Up, had begun. Inside the cabin, the fire was the only defense left. Adelaide kept the stove stuffed with seasoned wood. She hung heavy, wet blankets over the wooden doors. She covered the windows with rugs to stop the drafts. She kept the children in the very center of the room. They sat on the floor, basking in the radiating heat. On the third day of the storm, Silas stood by the window. The ice was 3 inches thick on the inside of the glass. "I have to check the barn and the cattle," he said grimly. "The water trough will be a solid block of iron ice. The cattle will die of thirst before the cold takes them." "You can't go out there, Silas," Adelaide cried out. "The wind will tear the breath right out of your lungs." "I have to go, or I lose everything I am," he said. He tied a heavy, thick rope around his frail waist. He gave the other end to Adelaide, his eyes urgent. "If I don't tug on this in 10 minutes, you pull me back. Pull with everything you have in your soul, Adelaide." He stepped out into the white, screaming abyss. The wind swallowed his frame instantly, leaving nothing. Adelaide held the rope, her knuckles white and frozen. She felt the vibration of the storm through the hemp fibers. She held it with every ounce of her remaining strength. 5 minutes passed, an eternity of cold. The rope was taut, vibrating like a guitar string. 10 minutes passed, and the clock ticked like a hammer. There was no tug, no signal from the white void. Adelaide felt a surge of pure, unadulterated panic. She didn't hesitate. She didn't even stop to think. Adelaide tied her end of the rope to the heavy oak kitchen table. Then she wrapped Martha's thick quilt around her shoulders. For 1 second, she looked back at Hattie and Leo. "Stay by the stove," she told them. "No matter what you hear, stay together." Outside, the wind erased the world. She followed the rope 1 hand at a time until she found Silas near the barn door, half buried in the drift. His eyes opened when she touched his shoulder. "Leave me," he whispered. Adelaide's tears froze against her cheeks. "No," she said. "My children have lost enough. You are not leaving them too." Silas looked at her through the snow. For a moment he seemed to see someone from long ago. "Martha," he breathed. Adelaide shook her head. "No, Adelaide, and I am getting you home." She pulled him free, inch by inch, refusing to let go of the rope or of him. She ignored the total numbness in her fingers and toes. She hauled him toward the heavy barn door with a roar. Inside, the cattle were lowing in a chorus of terror.
The windbreak Adelaide had built was actually working. The snow was drifting around the pine boughs, not over them. It was leaving a small, clear space for the shivering animals. Adelaide found a heavy iron bar leaning against the wall. She smashed the thick black ice in the water trough. She moved with a desperate, primal, and motherly energy. With Silas guiding her through the storm, Adelaide fed the cattle the extra grain, handful by handful. She made sure every single animal was standing on its feet. Then she turned back to Silas, who was weak with cold and pain. She dragged him back toward the house, through the storm. The rope was their only lifeline in the blinding whiteout. The journey of 50 feet felt like 50 miles of purgatory. Every single step was a battle for a single inch of ground. When they finally burst back into the kitchen, they collapsed. They lay on the floor, gasping for the warm, smoky air. Hattie and Leo ran to them, crying and praying.
They brought warm blankets and the heat of their young lives. Adelaide's hands were a terrifying shade of bruised purple. Silas was shaking uncontrollably from his very core. Adelaide didn't stop to rest. She didn't have the luxury. She heated heavy bricks on the stove until they hissed. She wrapped them in scraps of warm red flannel. She placed them at Silas's feet and against his sides. She forced him to drink hot beef broth, drop by drop. She rubbed his frozen hands until the color slowly returned. "You saved this ranch tonight," Silas whispered later. "And you saved an old, stubborn fool from his own pride." For weeks afterward, storms returned in waves, cutting the ranch off from the outside world. When the sun finally came out in January, it was blinding. The world was unrecognizable, silent, and terrifyingly still. Across Montana, ranchers faced terrible losses. Great herds disappeared beneath the snow, and many powerful cattle companies never recovered. The winter changed the open range forever. But at the Broken Spur, the 50 head were still alive. The windbreak had protected their frozen bodies. The smashed ice had kept them hydrated and strong. Adelaide's foresight had kept the heart of the ranch beating. In February, the great muddy thaw finally began. The snow turned into a vast sea of thick black mud. One morning, Silas called Adelaide into the main room. He was sitting at his old, scarred oak desk. An official legal document lay on the desk beside a letter from the town lawyer. "I sent word to Mr. Callahan after the storm," Silas said. "He prepared this partnership agreement, and he prepared a new will." Adelaide looked at him in surprise. "Barnaby?" "Barnaby can complain all he wants," Silas said, "but he cannot decide what I do with my own land." He placed his hand over the document. "This ranch is not just land to me anymore." His voice grew quieter. "It is the bread you baked, the coat you mended, the children laughing in the kitchen, the life you brought back into these walls." He swallowed. "Martha would have loved you, Adelaide." Adelaide lowered her eyes as tears gathered there. For the first time since losing her husband, she did not feel like a burden passing through someone else's life. She felt seen. Then he pushed the document toward her. "Half of the Broken Spur is yours, not as a favor, not as charity, as my partner." He looked toward the room where Leo and Hattie were playing. "And my will makes sure that if anything happens to me, this home remains yours and theirs." Adelaide looked out the window at the muddy valley. The first green shoots of grass were pushing through the mud. The mountains were still capped with a crown of white. But the air felt different, lighter, and full of promise. The biting fear of the unknown was finally gone. She reached out and took Silas's rough, calloused end. His skin felt like the bark of an ancient, sturdy tree, but his grip was steady, warm, and full of life. "We'll make it a good year, Silas," she said softly. "The best year this valley has ever seen since the beginning." That spring, the neighbors stopped their cruel whispering. They saw the smoke rising from the chimney every dawn. They saw the healthy cattle grazing in the warm sun. They saw a family where there had once been a ghost. Barnaby Thorne never showed his face on that land again. He knew he could not fight a woman like Adelaide Vance. She had faced the great blizzard and refused to blink. She had faced a lonely world and built a sanctuary of love.
As the years passed, the broken spur grew stronger. A garden rose beside the cabin. More cattle filled the pasture, and every winter smoke curled from the chimney before dawn. But the first log cabin quilt always remained on the main bed. Years later, when Hattie and Leo were grown, they still remembered the red square at the quilt center. On cold nights, they would draw it close and remember the winter when their mother refused to leave a frightened old man in the storm. To them, it was never just a quilt. It was proof that a broken house could become a home again. And on the coldest nights, Adelaide and Silas would sit by the fire while the children laughed nearby. Neither of them needed to say how far they had come. The warm house, the mended coat, and the old quilt said it for them. If this story brought warmth to your heart, please leave a like and subscribe. And if there is someone in your family who made a house feel like home, tell us about them in the comments. In the next story, a locked room in an old farmhouse will reveal a secret that waited 80 years to be found. Until then, may your home be warm, your table be full, and your heart never forget the people who helped you through the winter.